A lot of time spent in this class was spent talking about the GAPS model. The GAPS model refers to the customer gap, which is the difference between the customer's expectation of the service and the customer's perception of the service received. The provider gaps are the four factors that lead to the customer gap. The four provider gaps include the listening gap, the service design and standards gap, the service performance gap, and the communication gap. Going a little bit more into detail, the four factors that lead to provider gap 1, the listening gap, are inadequate customer research orientation, lack of upward communication, insufficient relationship focus, and inadequate service recovery. The factors leading to gap 2, the service design and standards gap, include poor service design, absence of customer-driven standards, and inappropriate physical evidence and service scape. Factors leading to gap 3, the service performance gap, include deficiencies in human resource policies, failure to match supply and demand, customers not fulfilling roles, and problems with service intermediaries. For gap 4, the communication gap, a few factors that lead to gap 4 include lack of integrated services marketing communications, ineffective management of customer expectations, overpromising, inadequate horizontal communications, and inappropriate pricing. So the purpose of this project was to apply what we had learned about the GAPS model to different establishments in the area. The four establishments that I chose to analyze were Starbucks, Cozy Thai, Olive Garden, and Sheetz. I decided to analyze Starbucks because, as an employee of Starbucks, I figured that I would have a different idea of some of the gaps that go on during service. I figured that while customers may have a little bit of an idea about some of the gaps that go on, having a behind the scenes look at the business model, I really kind of know what the strengths and weaknesses are. So, diving right into gap 1, the listening gap, I have found there to be a lack of upward communication. There are too many layers between contact personnel and top management. Corporate Starbucks employees are pretty much never in Starbucks stores. It really kind of creates this us and them culture where I feel like I don't know who I'm working for. A way that Starbucks would be able to address this is to have visits to stores, have their corporate employees come and introduce themselves. It might just create a better sort of flow between the corporate employees and the retail employees, and it might make the retail employees feel a little bit more valued. For gap 2, the service design and standards gap, I noticed poor service design due to unsystematic new service development processes. So the new mobile order and pay system that Starbucks has developed is good and bad. For customers that are on the move or don't want to wait in line, they're able to place their order from the mobile app. However, for employees in the store, when we're trying to focus on mobile orders, it makes it really hard to focus on customers in the actual cafe. Obviously, to solve this, I wish that we could just get rid of the mobile order system, but Starbucks doesn't want to do that. So a way that they'd be able to solve that would be to allow us to have more employees on staff during peak periods. If I have 3 people on staff at once, myself included, it makes it really hard to do orders for all the people in line as well as all the people placing orders from the app. For gap 3, the service performance gap, I noted failure to match supply and demand, a failure to smooth the peaks and valleys of demand. Simply put, there are not enough employees, almost similar to what I was talking about in gap 2. We have so many orders coming through in one day, it's extremely difficult to make sure that we are giving every customer the kind of service that Starbucks wants us to give them while still keeping it quick, quality service. I think that if Starbucks were to put an extra person on staff, it would really help us to be able to make that connection with customers and give them the quality service that we are supposed to. For gap number 4, the communications gap, I noted inadequate horizontal communications. Differences in policies and procedures across barriers or units can create inconsistencies that are very upsetting to customers when they don't understand why a certain policy is in place. For Starbucks specifically, I've noticed this with the policy of getting light iced drinks. People have become accustomed to ordering their drinks with light ice, meaning that they get more drink in their actual cup. However, our district manager recently told us we are not allowed to make light ice drinks all the way full because the lines on the Starbucks cup indicate where the drink is supposed to be filled to. We were running out of product and it was getting really hard to manage our inventory while we were doing so many drinks with light ice. Customers were very upset when we started telling them this, and I think that a way Starbucks could have avoided all of the upset customers is by releasing some sort of company-wide statement about their policy on light ice drinks. Even if customers don't like the policy, if they know that it is company-wide, they're going to be less likely to be upset about it. The second establishment I chose to visit was Cozy Thai. The first gap, the listening gap, I noticed inadequate service recovery. There was the failure to make amends when things go wrong. When my friend and I went to Cozy Thai, first off, we waited a little bit longer than we would have liked to for our table, which is fine, it was very busy. However, we were not greeted by our server for about 15 minutes after we sat down. Once we finally got our orders in, he brought us water after about 10 minutes. We drank our water, and it was never refilled again for the rest of the night. That was frustrating, but again, it was busy, so, he probably had other things going on. However, we were very disappointed when our entrees came out before our appetizers. When the server came around to see that we finally had our appetizer, all he said was, "Oh, your app finally came out." For me personally, if I were in this situation, I would have apologized to the customer and most likely spoken to my manager to be able to discount the app since they got it after their entree. However, this employee was not trained to do that, leading to this service gap. For gap number 2, the service design and standards gap, I noted inappropriate physical evidence and servicescape. There was inadequate maintenance and updating of the servicescape. Our table was so wobbly that our cups were almost spilling out onto the table. The table next to us noticed us wobbling the table and said to us that their table was wobbly too. This is a very easy fix for Cozy Thai if they do regular inspections of their servicescape to make sure that they are ready and that they are well maintained. For gap 3, the service performance gap, I've noticed deficiencies in human resource policies. This would be ineffective recruitment. Each employee that we interacted with that night, which was only 2, the hostess and our server, they were not very good at their jobs. So obviously, people can have good days and bad days. However, we really were not left with a good feeling when we left there. Cozy Thai can solve this by hiring employees that are better equipped to work in a customer contact position. For gap number 4, the communications gap, I noted inappropriate pricing. As I discussed earlier, our service was not what we would have expected it to be, especially with the prices that we were paying. The quality of the food was fine, however, when the service is not up to par, we don't feel like we're getting a good value for our dollar. So that is what caused the communication gap in this instance. The third establishment I chose to visit was Olive Garden. For gap 1, the listening gap, I noted a lack of upward communication. There was a lack of interaction between management and customers because there were no managers walking around the dining room doing table touches, which is very important in a restaurant. Obviously, this can be fixed by making sure that there is a manager at the restaurant at all times to do table touches. The second gap, the service design and standard gap, I noticed poor service design. There was an unsystematic new service development process, like at Starbucks with the mobile order and pay system. I'm referring to the Ziosk machines that are now on tables in all Olive Gardens. In my opinion, having a little machine to pay at really takes a huge step out of a service-based company. So I think that having the Xeos machines really is counterintuitive to what you are trying to do with having a server and having your whole restaurant experience. If I were a manager or somebody who worked in corporate at Olive Garden, I would suggest that they be removed from the restaurants. For gap number 3, the service performance gap, I noticed problems with service intermediaries. This was a difficulty controlling quality and consistency. Because the breadsticks are batch cooked, after a while, when they sit there, they become really chewy and hard to bite into. This, again, is a very easy fix. If Olive Garden were to just set a timer and not serve breadsticks that have been sitting in the basket for longer than about 10 minutes, maybe, they would not be serving breadsticks that weren't up to par. For gap number 4, the communication gap, I noted inappropriate pricing. Maybe this is just me being cheap, but Olive Garden, as good as it is, I think that their average check is very high for the service and the food that you're getting. If I go with a friend, we will easily spend $60 there in a night when we could spend $30 like we did at Cozy Thai. So for the communication gap, as I said, I noticed high prices that raise customer expectations. I believe that their prices should be adjusted to create a better value, which may also cause an increase in the number of covers that they serve. The final establishment that I chose to visit was Sheetz. For gap 1, the listening gap, I noted a lack of upward communication. This was caused by insufficient communication between contact employees and managers. During an extremely busy time, the shift manager on duty was not adequately directing employees to where they needed to be. So when the shift manager wasn't delegating employees to their proper stations, it was affecting everything in the restaurant, and we ended up waiting for about a half an hour to be able to get our food. A way to solve this is to make sure that shift managers are trained on how to delegate which employees are to go where and when they should make decisions like that. For the service design and standards gap for Sheetz, I noted inappropriate physical evidence and servicescape. The servicescape design did not meet the customer needs. The waiting area in Sheetz on Pew Street is very, very small, especially for somewhere that is downtown and gets very, very crowded on late nights on the weekends. So obviously space downtown is very limited, so they're not really able to expand the building. However, I believe they would be able to kind of counteract this by having really effective training on getting customers in and out as quick as possible, so you're not having that super crowded feeling in the food waiting area. For gap number 3, the service performance gap, I noted customers not fulfilling roles, customers negatively impacting each other. As I said, I went later on at night, so I happened to get lumped in with a lot of the bar crowd. I was coming from a crazy night of Netflix, actually, and was noticing customers that had just come from the bar bumping into each other, yelling, being very disruptive to everyone around. By being, that disruptive, they were negatively impacting my experience as well as other sober customers in the area. This can be solved by hiring more security guards to be stationed by the waiting area, as this seems to be the most rowdy area of the establishment. Finally, for the communication gap in Sheetz, I have down overpromising. Overpromising in advertising, because Sheetz advertises their loyalty program. I personally am never able to use it because none of the made-to-order food that I get is applicable to the rewards program. Sheetz would be able to address this by encompassing all of their made-to-order food in their rewards program, which would likely drive an increase in revenues because people would want to return and get that better value of the reward. A few thoughts that I had moving out of this project. I was very, very surprised at how easy it was to find factors for each one of the gaps. I thought that it was going to be a lot harder than it was, but I think that now having this skill, being able to analyze these situations for service failures, is going to be very helpful in a hospitality management career. And I think that it is going to be very useful to just kind of every now and again stop and make sure that your organization is running, and making sure that they are filling all the gaps.